So as Frank mentioned, I'm going to talk about our work exploring experiences of marginalization and vulnerability discovery. This was joint work between my colleagues at University of Maryland, Tufts University, University of Chicago, and Global Secure Partners. So the security industry is facing a global shortage of workers. In fact, there's an estimate from last year that says we're about short 3.4 million workers. And in fact, the community has grown to try to meet this need to a record 4.7 million people. However, despite this growth, there remains a striking lack of diversity, both for women and other minorities in executive roles, as well as limited opportunities for career growth for women and minorities. And in fact, nearly a third of both women and minorities feel that they don't belong within the security community altogether. And so you might be saying, why does this matter? And I argue that it matters for two reasons. One, it indicates an equity problem. If members of underrepresented populations feel that they don't belong, or in fact they report not having the ability to grow in careers, it means that they have limited opportunities for these lucrative careers. However, I argue it also matters for a technical reason. As I'm sure many of you are aware of Linus's law that given enough eyes, all bugs are shallow, and in fact, not having a big enough security community breaks Linus's law in and of itself. However, there's been work that has shown that diverse perspectives are needed to avoid blind spots, and so having a relatively homogeneous security community means that we don't have as much creative thinking, and thus we have a less effective community overall. And so this got us wondering, where does this disparity and diversity come in vulnerability discovery in particular? And so we wanted to understand, one, how do members from marginalized populations come to participate in vulnerability discovery? Do they feel accepted and supported? As well as what explicit challenges do they face as they try to enter and stay in this community? So to do this, we conducted 16 semi-structured interviews. When we recruited, we didn't use the term marginalized populations. We actually used the term historically underrepresented members of the community. We did this because we didn't want to dissuade anyone from advocating as being a member from an underrepresented population, and the term marginalized populations actually came from the experiences of our participants. During our interviews, we had participants start by self-describing both their work and their personal identity, and then we had them walk us through their career and vulnerability discovery. We essentially structured this portion like a career review that helped participants kind of explain their progress at each step in their career from their very first interest in security up until present day. And then we analyzed this data using open coding. So to start, I'll highlight how some of our participants came to participate in vulnerability discovery. So our participants kind of took three paths into vulnerability discovery that mirror results from prior work. So the first path they took was having others introduce them, like friends or family that were already in vulnerability discovery. Other participants got into the field through tangential activities, like a general interest in programming, or an interest in tinkering, like taking things apart and putting them back together. And lastly, some participants were drawn to a very specific aspect of vulnerability discovery, such as the subject matter, the monetary incentives, or the community passion. Our participants used kind of two big types of learning resources to get into the community. So one being resources with a built-in structure in which participants could learn and were kind of guided along as they used the resource. This included things like hacking challenges, certifications, as well as online courses. The other big type is unstructured resources, in which participants could learn from using the resource, but there was no inherent guide or structure built into the learning material. This included things like on-the-job learning, YouTube videos, as well as hacking sites. So now that we know how they come to participate, let's talk a little bit about whether they feel accepted and supported. Specifically in the context of mentoring. So one way that our participants felt accepted and supported were through the use of mentors, and in fact, they were deemed to be essential by our participants. As one of our participants put it, they would have failed early on if they didn't have the support of their mentor. And in fact, we actually think that mentors may be more essential in vulnerability discovery than in other fields. For every participant, when we asked them to chart their career, their first mentor or their first good mentor was a dramatic inflection point in which they reported limited growth before their first mentor and then exponential growth after. And this was because mentors provided a couple of essential resources for our participants, resources that aren't necessarily unique to vulnerability discovery, but help with unique aspects of this community. So they provided things like hands-on help, which is especially important in the vulnerability discovery community because of the insular nature of the field, or the lone wolf idea. And so having this hands-on help actually provided essential validation and guidance for our participants. Mentors also offered connections to programs and organizations, and this is especially important because vulnerability discovery is inherently competitive, in which oftentimes the first person to discover a bug or identify a vulnerability is the only one that's going to get paid for it. And so mentors offered a connection to programs, and in fact, many of our participants only experienced career development through their mentors. And lastly, mentors shared things like relevant resources, which is especially important in vulnerability discovery, where much learning is done online. Nearly all learning is done through online resources, and there's a wide array of available online resources. However, it's not possible to view all of them, and so mentors reduce this wide array to a manageable amount for our participants. And in fact, we saw a marked increase in self-efficacy, activity, and expectations for our participants after they met their first good mentor. Our participants also reported feeling accepted and supported when they were able to perceive representation and diversity within the community. Specifically, perceiving themselves within the community felt welcoming, as if they saw someone who looked like them being successful, they thought they had a chance at being successful. But even more broadly, participants reported a general sense of diversity within the community as being welcoming. For example, one of our participants said that they felt welcome because their class was really diverse and had a lot of different people from different backgrounds. And so lastly, let's talk a little bit about the challenges that these people face. Specifically, they face kind of two big challenges that aren't necessarily unique to them. So first big challenge is going to be education. And this is partially due to the fact that materials lack a clear structure, as we talked about before, which can make it very difficult to parse out what's useful, what's not useful, as well as it can be difficult to guide themselves through as they try to use these materials. But these materials also assume a technical background, which is not completely unfair, but for members of underrepresented populations who historically have been underrepresented in other technical fields, assuming this technical background can put them at a distinct disadvantage over others. Another key challenge is the competitive landscape of vulnerability discovery. So first of all, there's a lack of attainable entry positions, and so it can be very difficult to break into this field. There's also an outcome uncertainty that comes with vulnerability discovery. As discussed before, oftentimes the first person to identify a vulnerability is the only one who gets paid. And so if you invest lots of time and resources into looking for these, but you're not the first one there, that means you may not actually benefit from the time you spent in. And these results are actually mirrored in other work from colleagues coming up at Usenix 2023. However, a perhaps unique challenge faced by our participants is community. So vulnerability hunters usually solve the prior two challenges through the use of community. But in fact, community was actually a key challenge for participants in our study. And this can be attributed to a few things. One, in a difficulty being taken seriously. As one of our participants put it, they went to a hacking meetup and they could tell that everybody was looking at them, not taking them seriously, and kind of wondering, like, what is this person even doing here? They also noted a key challenge being a lack of representation and diversity. For example, one of our participants went to a hacking meetup and said they were appalled and kind of felt ostracized because no one there looked anything like them. And in fact, unhelpful mentors. So while we noticed that mentors are a key benefit and important to feeling supported, it turns out that unhelpful mentors were a key challenge faced by our participants. As one of our participants put it, they had a mentor who said, please ask me questions, and then every time they would ask a question, their mentor would criticize them for not figuring it out on their own. And these unhelpful mentors can be caused by something called token mentoring. And in the vulnerability discovery community, mentors are encouraged to mentor for financial reasons or workplace requirements, which can create mentoring by unwilling mentors. And finally, every single one of our participants mentioned some form of explicit discrimination, such as sexism, racism, sexual assault, transphobia, and homophobia. Now, while the community is also a challenge that our participants face, more importantly, not having the supportive community compounds the other challenges that our participants face, as I mentioned early on. So our results offer a few key takeaways. The number one being that mentors were essential. They help participants navigate getting into the community, as well as building successful careers in vulnerability discovery. And so we advocate for helping mentees reach willing mentors, possibly through a mentor-mentee matching program, so mentees know the members of the community that are safe to approach for help. We also suggest something like open office hours, where senior members of the community can hold an open forum for people to approach and ask them questions. Finally, we suggest anonymous mentoring that may allow members of marginalized populations to keep their marginalized identity secret so they can feel safe navigating the community and asking questions. I want to thank the NSF and Google for sponsoring this work, and with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay, great. Any questions? If you have a question, please come up to the mic in the center of the room.
Thanks for the really great talk. I just have a quick question. Did this primarily focused on on people in the open source vulnerability discovering community, or is this also looking at people who are actually working in like a structured company doing vulnerability discovery?
Yeah, so we had a mix of both in our study. We didn't explicitly go after people who only did bug bounty platforms. We spread pretty far to anybody who worked in the security community in a vulnerability discovery type role. And we had a mix of people who did bug bounty platforms, but I would say a majority of our participants came from people who actually held some type of role within a company doing this, yeah.
One question that I was wondering about, are all of the folks that you interviewed still part of the vulnerability discovery community, or were some of them like essentially they left because of all of the challenges they faced?
Yeah, it's a great question. So part of the problem with recruiting for a study like this is that we advertised a lot, and we had a really great partner in recruiting for this, but we advertised on forums that involved vulnerability discovery because that was the best way to get to this audience. And unfortunately, there's not really a platform for, I used to be in vulnerability discovery, but I left. So that's an inherent limitation of this. We did see a little bit of people who had attempted bug bounties or had been in bug bounty platforms and got very low yield on like bugs that they had found. So for example, didn't get paid out the bounty that they should have, having found a bug, and kind of stepped away from it. But a majority of our participants were still involved in the community because it's the nature of recruiting for a study like this, yeah.
Great. Any other questions? Let me ask one more. So I was also wondering, so you talked about how mentors were super helpful for this. I was wondering whether there were other things that your participants kind of mentioned that were very positive experiences for them. Like, did they see communities doing certain things that really helped them out? Yeah, just examples that other people can perhaps follow in the future.
Yeah, so that's a good question. I will say that we saw a mixed result, which is kind of answer it, but for things like affinity groups, so like women in cyber or blacks in cyber, right? Some participants mentioned them as being incredibly helpful and incredibly useful because they gave them a sense of community and a place of belonging. But interestingly enough, people who sat at the intersection of two identities and feel like they didn't belong to one identity over another found affinity groups to be incredibly difficult to navigate because they didn't feel like they belonged in blacks in cyber or women in cyber, and there wasn't like a intersectional group because that turns out that's very difficult to do. So it doesn't explicitly answer your question where affinity groups were helpful for some people, but I think it's an interesting piece that it wasn't helpful for everybody and something that we should consider with care as we kind of move forward, yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for this great talk. I was really interested in the way that you described the competitive, like zero-sum nature of vulnerability discovery as potentially contributing to some of the challenges. And I was wondering, like, if bug bounties gave partial credit, or are there ways to restructure the incentives that would change how participants were experiencing the community?
Yeah, so that's a great question. One of the things we advocated for that isn't bug bounties specific, but does have to do with the lack of attainable entry positions, which kind of hints on the bug bounty thing, is making it really clear what are the minimum requirements that are needed to be able to join this community. This is not unique just to vulnerability discovery, but I think to tech jobs in general, where the listings are asking for experiences that don't necessarily match up with what they need, and they don't know how to look for the soft skills that lend well to someone who enters this field. Maybe it's like you don't have, I don't know, tons of bug bounty experience, but you are, a really creative thinker, and that's actually a really useful skill. So one of the things that we suggested, and there's been some prior work in this, is exploring how to kind of measure those more complex soft skills that'll help people get into the community. Doesn't hint at the partial credit part of bug bounty platforms, but it would help people kind of avoid that zero sum of, I don't meet all the requirements, I can't apply, I don't, there's no way for me to break into the community.
Okay, great. So we're right at time. So let's thank Kelsey again for an awesome talk.